Will we be any wiser tomorrow morning when we wake up here in Israel as to who will be the next president of the United States?
Well, I think that the fact that we have 100 million people who voted early could really mean 100 million reasons why we won't know who's the winner. I think part of that reason is because some of the states only will begin to count those votes on this election day and later on. That could take some time, especially when we're talking about these really states that we're not sure what the outcome will be, these battleground states. So I think part of the reason why we won't know, or we have a reason not to know who will be the winner, is because many of the states will still have to decipher the votes that were made before Election Day.
In terms of the battleground states, because each state really does have its own policy in terms of when it started opening the ballots, how long after the election it will count them. What's the situation in terms of these states and their tabulations and how that fits into the Electoral College math?
Well, I think some of these states, both campaigns are already focusing on. We've seen reports that both the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign already have lawyers waiting on the tarmac to be sent to these places. We can look at states like Pennsylvania, states like Florida, states like Ohio. We can also foresee some difficulties in states where maybe there was an increase in voting before Election Day because of the coronavirus challenge. So I think part of what we're going to have to be looking at is whether or not the fact that we have to count these votes leads to a judicial process which will make it longer for these states to decide whether or not they went red or whether or not they went blue.
How tight do you see these races? Polls certainly were showing, though Biden was in the lead in many of these states that had flipped, the margins were tightening as we approach today.
Yeah, I think we have to look at the fact that much of the Trump support, even looking at the 2016 election, came from people who were very much against what they call the elites, people who represent the media and others. And I think that also causes them to maybe less participate in polls, less participate in any sort of groups that seek to decipher and discover what people really feel in those states. Another thing is that since 2016, we've also seen an increase in awareness as to whether or not Trump represents the things that he promised in his previous campaign. And I think some people might think that Trump delivered on some of what he promised, but on the other hand, they're afraid to say that they're for Trump because of all the type of climate that we see both in America and around the world. So I think part of what we have to look at when looking at the polls and whether or not it's really tight is to what extent do they really present the current opinion on the ground.
It has been an incredibly bitter and divisive campaign. Trump himself in his campaign has intimated unrest could break out afterwards as part of his campaign messaging. Is there concern, do you think? We've certainly seen stores barricading in certain cities that this transition or this wait for a final decision could lead to violence, that we'll see disturbances?
Yeah, I think that that's a big concern, both for those who are for Trump and those who are for Biden. I think that looking at the current American situation, if you look at the elections, you look at the coronavirus, you look at the economic challenges, this could mean that more people will be maybe incited to go to the streets from both camps. We can also see a possibility that even if a winner is announced, we'll see increased protests of the other camp till the actual inauguration on January 20th at noon. So I think this is a major possibility. And as you say, we've seen some increased presence by law enforcement. We've seen barricades. We've seen stores putting up different means of protecting themselves. And this whole plate is really something that is brewing. And I think that's a very strong possibility. And I won't even rule out violence directed against U.S. installations and missions abroad.
Which would be driven by which elements?
Well, by those who are unwilling to accept the results, whether those who are for Trump and see that Biden won and they want to try to take it out on the new administration that will be coming up, or those who are for Biden and Trump wins. This could also lead to others. We've already seen previously protests against Trump abroad, different areas for different reasons. So I can't rule out the fact that the public opinion abroad may also react in a negative way depending on the results.
Without going too much into the matrix of the electoral college count, do you see any particular states which, if they're called tonight for either candidate, will give us a definitive answer regardless of the counting of the additional votes?
I think it's hard to say. I think that even if a state is called, there's still various things that can happen to make that call go back. I think we'll have to keep an eye on what the different media organizations are saying. We have to also keep an eye on whether or not we see a mass sending of lawyers and different individuals to those states. And I think that this time around, different media organizations might take time to call some of these swing states. For example, it could be Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, maybe even Arizona. I think that looking at history, some of the states have been very integral to, for example, Republican winning elections, states like Ohio, where for many, many years, if the Republicans don't get it, they have maybe less of a possibility of winning the White House. But I think because of what's going on in the whole situation, it's going to be difficult to say whether or not the calling of those states is actually the result in the field, especially if we're talking about these swing states.
This election is taking place against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic, the health blow that it's had on the American population, the economic crisis. What do you see as the main domestic issues driving voters?
Yeah, I think that the coronavirus medical challenge has really brought about two narratives in terms of Biden versus Trump. I think one narrative is who's responsible for the virus. I think that if you look at polls, recent polls in the last few months in the United States, the more the virus spreads, the more a negative opinion of China spreads. And I think that's something that might cause more people to be encouraged to vote for Donald Trump, not because Donald Trump is someone who they feel could solve the situation, but more about why he's maybe classifying the situation correctly. We've seen that even the Biden campaign in recent weeks has taken a tougher view of China. Even in the debate, the last debate, Joe Biden called the president of China, Xi Jinping, he called him a thug. He's doing it not just because maybe he believes that, but because he sees that the American public is more viewing China as a negative actor who might be responsible, who is responsible in the current situation with the pandemic. So I think the coronavirus, on the one hand, could cause people to see a situation mismanaged, and more people might vote for Trump. But on the other hand, I think this is even more significant, going to Trump because he's the candidate who seems to be more tougher on China. I think the second opinion or narrative is really the issue of freedom. And I think looking at the medical situation, more and more Americans are looking at this election as who is the one who puts freedom as a priority. And I think things like masks, which many people might believe it's a good thing and we should put it on. But on the other hand, I should myself decide to put it on and not the government. I shouldn't be told to do things for my own health. I can decide it on my own, with my own means. So I think that's also something which is a big factor and could be influencing who the people vote for.
But what about those who are concerned about health care coverage, those who are concerned about jobs that didn't materialize or which vanished because of the pandemic, or those who are looking at the issues of race and conflict that erupted also in these past few months? Those might say would direct votes towards Biden.
Well, for the economic issue, I think that it's true. Most people feel that the economy has taken a hit. But I think that if we look at polls, most people view Trump as the person who can maybe solve the economic problem better than Biden in terms of what he did even before. I think that's one thing that maybe plays to his advantage. On the issue of the race relations, I think that it is true that that's a major issue which has caused many protests ever since the George Floyd incident and other incidents on camera with policemen and protesters and African Americans. But I think that part of what Americans are viewing Trump as being is not so much as someone who is flaming the fire, but someone who maybe stands for law and order. And I think that's something that Trump has realized, and that's why he's talking about that. He's saying that these protests are not so much about improving the rights of minorities, and he's saying, I do it the best, but it's really being directed against the traditions of America, the statues, the history. And that's something that's very dear to Americans, and I think that also could, in the end, play to Trump's advantage.
Now, briefly, this isn't just a presidential election. We have elections in Congress, which currently the House of Representatives is controlled by the Democrats and the Senate by the Republicans. Do you expect any major shifts in Congress?
There could be shifts. I think it will all depend on the voter turnout in some of these states. Voter turnout by those who feel that the system has failed them in terms of maybe race relations or economy. I don't necessarily think that states that will be going red, for example, will have a higher probability of also having a red or Republican congressional delegation. That's not always true. We've seen states that have, Democratic governors and congressmen who are Democratic, but in the end, they vote Republican, or the opposite. So I think it really depends. I think that those members of Congress who are running for re-election, who have received support for Trump during his rallies and different things that he's done, on the one hand, this could help them, especially in states where the population sees Trump as a positive president. But on the other hand, it could also hurt them when it comes to states that are viewing Trump in a negative way.
Finally, looking abroad in terms of internationally and international relations, there's been much talk about how whoever wins will affect international ties, Israel-U.S. ties. What impact do you think will be there?
Well, I think the relationship with the United States is strong. It will continue to be strong even when Biden is elected, if he is elected. I think that certain moves that Donald Trump made with regards to the embassy and other things, I don't see Joe Biden canceling them because in the end, there's something that have also impacted U.S. Relations with the world and also relations between the U.S. and Israel. And I think that's something that Joe Biden will want to continue. On the other hand, if Joe Biden is elected, we can see an increased move to connect or reconnect with the Palestinians. They stand to gain if Donald Trump is defeated. I think that other countries of concern to Israel, like Iran, probably stand to gain because Joe Biden might be more inclined to reach a similar deal, nuclear deal with Tehran, as he supported the Iran deal when his boss, President Obama, signed it. But on the other hand, I think that no matter if Joe Biden is elected or Trump is reelected, I think that we're going to be seeing a major shift or a major impact when it comes to Israeli-American relations, when it comes to the Israeli relationship with China. And I think that the next U.S. administration, no matter if it's Trump or Biden, will be hardening its policy towards China, and especially trying to pressure or cause Jerusalem to change its orientation when it comes to Beijing. And I think that's something that is really the question of the century that the leadership in Israel will be having to answer after November 3rd.